0 to 100 is a podcast dedicated to bringing you quality conversations and insights on resiliency in physical, mental, social, and spiritual fitness through engaging discussions with those in the military and beyond.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the 0 to 100 podcast. I'm your host, Mark, with my co-host, Steve. And today we are going to talk about mental health and spiritual health, or mental performance, spiritual performance, however you want to frame it these days. And I have a great guest for us to have a conversation with, who is a Navy psychologist, Commander Chris Blair. He works at Headquarters Marine Corps now, but he's done everything. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask him to tell us, introduce yourself, tell us what you've done and what your background is like, and we'll jump right in.
Sure. Thanks. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me over. Looking forward to our conversation today. So, Commander Chris Blair, I've been in the Navy now 20 and a half years. And I've had wonderful opportunities to do lots of different things throughout my career. I've been stationed at little clinics and hospitals, whether that's like at Cherry Point or Hawaii. I've been stationed on a carrier. I was on the USS Ronald Reagan out of San Diego. Got a couple deployments out of that. Done a deployment down to Guantanamo Bay. Been embedded, an Oscar provider, 3rd Regiment out in Hawaii. Been able to do some assessment selection stuff with presidential support at 8th and I and up at Camp David and HMX. And again, I've also been up at the big hospitals at Bethesda as a deputy director up there. So I've got experience at little clinics, bigger clinics, the huge medical centers, embedded with Marines, assessment selection. Now I'm the senior clinical advisor, doing policy stuff. So not as exciting as glamorous, but a lot of experience that kind of goes into all of those things. So looking forward to being here and having a conversation today.
Yeah, awesome. And you're married?
I'm married.
Kids,
yeah,
right?
I've been married. Married my high school sweetheart. So yeah, went to prom together back in 1990. That gives you an idea how old I am. So we've been married 28 years. I've got 4 kids. Oldest being 25, and I got a 25-year-old son, 21-year-old daughter, 20-year-old daughter, and 17-year-old son. I got one left in the house before I'm an empty nester.
Okay.
So everyone's out at college doing things. And so, and we've been in the area here. We're in DC, and we've been here since 2013 when I got the billet at 8th and I, and then I was up at Bethesda and now here. So just kind of changing my commute on the 95.
Yeah.
Good or bad.
Just can't get enough.
Yeah.
So as we kind of jump into talking about the state of affairs when it comes to mental health, spiritual health, in the Marine Corps, some in the Navy, and just there's obviously some overlap there. So there's a book that I was reading recently. It's called Resilience, and it speaks from a faith perspective. But one of the things that the author said really stuck out to me, and he said, "We haven't fully paid our mental health debt post-COVID." So, and what he was saying is, we're so eager to move on, to get back to normal and feel happy again, that we want to just put everything behind us. But there's a lot of long-term residual grief, pain, loss, whatever, right? Like there's a long list here of things that we have endured because of COVID that we're not owning up to. Therefore, we won't be able to process. And so we have this massive check that we need to write that we're not writing. What are your thoughts on that? Like, just as we're still in COVID, but obviously, trying to get out of it, move on. What's your read on just as a father, as a husband, as somebody working at headquarters, but also as a clinician?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great comment too that he's made, because I think one that speaks to a lot of how we deal with stress and challenges is we don't. Something comes up and we just, it's gone, and we just want to just move on. Just keep moving ahead. Don't look at it. And all our problems, all our issues, they're all still there. We just sort of stuff it down. It's like, if I tell my kid to clean the room and they just throw everything under the bed and in the closet, it might look okay, but there's all this crap that's still there. So don't open the closet. So a lot of times people walk around and they might look okay, but it's still there. And so, and it's all right at the surface. And so we need to be able to talk about these things. What is it that you're upset about or frustrated about? Or, people, one, when you're home all the time, sometimes it took a toll on relationships, thought your relationship was great. Maybe it's like, well, it's great when, we're only spending like 2 hours a day because we're all at work. Now we're here. We can't go anywhere. Maybe it's a challenge. My kids are awesome. Oh my gosh. Now I've got to like teach them all of this stuff. And that can be difficult. And so what sort of came to the surface, and this kind of goes to like to me is sort of a deeper issue, and one that I think comes up a lot of times in the military. What I'll hear a lot of times is like the military, ruined my marriage. The military did, X, Y, Z, and maybe. But what I how I look at it is, whatever issues you have, it's kind of like you get a little crack in your windshield. It happens all the time in 95. Yeah. You get a little chip. Yep. If you don't address it, eventually when the temperature starts changing at different things, it starts splitting, and it's a big issue. Yeah. So the military is kind of like putting that extra pressure on things. You might have a little chip, and maybe you can go years without it really being an issue. But now throw in deployments, throw in PCSs, throw in you got to be away from your social support or different things. It's going to amplify that. If you've got communication problems in your relationship, and now you're deployed, and you're not talking very frequently, well, good luck. Yeah. If you might have some minor jealousy issues, right, and then you're gone for a while, again, all these things are amplified. And I think COVID was one of those things. And a lot of times people were just sort of walking around not knowing what these issues are, and that put things in such a pressure that all these things sort of blew up, whether it's communication stuff, relationships, whatever the issue is. And you might blame COVID, and that was the catalyst, but what was going on, before. Yeah. And I think you're right. There's a debt that has to be paid, but are we willing to pay? Are we willing to look at like what was going on? If you had communication issues, are you willing to work on those communication issues? Really, are you willing to work on those things? Because again, we just kind of move on. Like, okay, I can go to restaurants now. I can go out, and I don't really want to think about these things, but it's still there. Yeah. So.
What are you seeing a trend in any direction in terms of the Marine Corps? Like whether we're just fixed on moving on, or is there kind of an effort to let's so maybe 2 steps forward, 3 steps back kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see, so it sort of runs the gamut. I do see, I think it's great that people acknowledge a lot of, these things and what's going on. Sometimes the pendulum swings a little too far, and maybe it's quick to blame COVID on all these things. Like, well, is it really COVID? It's the nice sort of hook to hang your hat on. So one, we're acknowledging it, but there's still the sort of the mentality of being a Marine and, suck it up, be sort of just move on. And, that was in the past, just keep plowing forward, even if you got to white knuckle it through it, the whole thing. And we've done better at that. I mean, I've been in for 20 years, and I've seen us do a whole lot better, in the 20 years that I've been in. But there's still work to do when it comes to stigma of, your emotional well-being, emotional health, and what we need to do.
As you say that, it's interesting, right? When I talk to very senior Marines, they're all very open about talking about that, whether they enlisted or officer. They're very transparent about their own challenges, and they value emotional intelligence and the human side of things. But the machine, right, of the Marine Corps, that it's kind of rifle. It is like a very young demographic, right? Mm-hmm. Like you get them in, you train them, you get them you get them to be strong, tough, and then they're like the tip of the spear. Boom, they're the battering ram. Mm-hmm. In your time of advisement or talking to leadership, do you feel like it just cannot translate to that level? Because then now it makes them vulnerable, right? If a 19-year-old, a brand new Marine is told to be more self-aware, take more time to process things, and be more in touch with their humanity, while war is a very inhumane thing, right? It's a dehumanizing thing. And they're told to now be a very lethal weapon in that war. Do you think it creates a conflict they can't handle?
No, but I do see this as something that has to work over time, in the sense that, again, I'm thinking back to when I came in 20 years ago, with probably half the majority of people that are listening who weren't even alive when I came in. Where the senior officers are just like, suck it up, what are you doing? You're weak, and so it took a lot of work to tear down that stick. And now those very junior officers, when I started, they're now the senior leaders, and they get it. But then I still think that there's kind of a gap between, I understand it academically and I understand the importance, but then when the rubber hits the road, what does that do for my particular unit and readiness? What do I do with that? So I think there's still work to be done, because I think they get it. They know what needs to be done. And, a lot of them they're fantastic. But then it is that how does it apply right now? I want everyone to be in tune and get whatever help they need. But we've got, UDP coming up. We got these other things, and maybe get that taken care of. I know it's important, and we'll say it's important, but, when the rubber hits the road, how do we actually, apply it? So,
yeah. If you were the top psychologist in the Navy for a day, right, and put 2 stars on you and said, hey, fix it, make it better, what are the top 3 things that would be on your radar?
That is an excellent question. I think a couple things would be on mine. One, I think assessment and selection for people coming into the military.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of, we got to teach, resilience, and we do. And there's a lot of great things that we teach. But being completely honest here, if you haven't learned resilience by the time you're 18 or 20, we're behind the curve. And that's not our job. So we can help with that, and I can give you some skills to work on these things. But true sort of resilience and grit, it is something that can be learned, and there's a lot of things that we can teach, but sometimes that can be a challenge. And so making sure that we get the right people in.
So you're speaking before boot camp, right? Yeah. Even before that, choosing the right people.
Exactly. How do we do that to get the right people in the right, MLS or NEC. Doing those things. Okay,
so I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to play the recruiting command's, XO's job, with the stick. It's like, Doc, you know how many man hours that would take? You know how long the process will be? We don't have the money nor the time to take good deep dive into people's lives that much. Mm-hmm. So how can it be done, realistically? Are there some easy buttons you see that we're not taking advantage of?
Definitely don't see any easy buttons.
Yeah.
I think
you're talking about predicting resiliency somewhat, right?
Yeah, somewhat predicting resiliency, and also making sure that we get people in the right, MOSs or in the right service. Is the Marine Corps, and this is where it's difficult because we want it, but maybe you would be better off in the Army or the Navy or different things. Why are you specifically joining this service? To be the best. All right, awesome. I hear that all the time. But why specifically? Is it you got a chip on your shoulder? You got to prove something to somebody else because they said that you couldn't get to boot camp, or whatever. Now you're through boot camp and you saw another 3.5 years. Now what do I do? Yeah. And the right MOS. How do we get them where they need to be? So is it just
the talent management?
So it's just the ASVAB? You scored this, and so you're going to be great at Intel. Maybe.
Yeah.
But what are you really going to be good at? And so there would be a lot of that kind of stuff. And being able to have, and this is a much bigger sort of sociological and political type thing, is how do we talk, to society and communities where we can, help. What can we do to help, families and other people when they're younger? How do we deal with all of that versus here we go and we just assume this kid's got problems, growing up to me, it's jail or military, that's not a solution, or go to military school, that'll clean them up. Well, no. So how do we manage it? So
I think that's key.
That would be a big challenge. So there might be some resources, but it might just be one thing. Again, being in long enough, what I see happen is a lot of times we've got the working hard part down, but are we working efficiently? Yeah. We're doing a lot of stuff, and we're working hard, but maybe we've got a lot of resources, or we got things out there. Are they allocated to the right thing? Are we looking at the right thing?
Yeah.
And maybe we can just sort of tweak things a little bit so we don't have to, reinvent the wheel.
Right.
So it might just be doing the same kind of, screenings, but, adding one little thing, or what are we actually, looking at, taking their, interest in mind, helping them fully understand what it is that they're doing. Maybe, again, it has to do with, recruiters and other things. How many times does somebody come into my office or your office like, your recruiter lied to me?
Yeah.
Like, okay, I can build a career. That's not all of that. And so
he's got one of those stories for himself as a sailor on a ship.
This is not what I signed up for. And so a lot of it, what are we doing to make sure that we fully educate people? So part of well, let me back up here. Here's a quick little sort of explanation of stress. A nice formula for stress is when there is a difference between your expectations and reality. The greater the difference, the greater the discrepancy, the more stress that we're going to feel. And so a lot of times I may not be able to change reality, but maybe the expectations, when they're my expectations, I can change them. I created them, so I can change them. Maybe we need to do a better job of helping them understand really what's going on, what is going to be expected of them. Just a little story, when I was doing presidential screenings and stuff, it was real critical for me to let them know that, there's some amazing, cool stuff they're going to be able to do in this job. 95% of your job, you're standing post, you're checking IDs. It's awful. It's like, oh, you're going to be up at Camp David. Yeah, and hopefully it's really boring. Because if it's not, we're talking some historic event. It's going to be boring. It's not really what you think it's going to be. And I would even sometimes, like a parent, what did I just say? 95% of my job is going to be, I got it. And so I thought it was important to explain that. And I would still have people, once they would come on the program, they're like, hey, Doc, when do we fast rope off of, HMX and rappel at the White House? I'm like, never. That doesn't happen. No, you told us. Like, I didn't. And so sometimes when they had those expectations that like, oh, I'm going to be rappelling off the White House and fast roping off HMX, if that's the expectation and the reality is, I'm up at 8th and I, and I'm standing post at 2 a.m, and there's a homeless person that's defecating on the side of their, that's living the dream. This is not, this is not what I was expecting.
Talking to social services.
Exactly. Like, oh my gosh. So it's managing those expectations. So back to the recruiting thing. I know the recruiters, that is such a challenging job. More power to them. That would be, I couldn't do that job, to be honest. It would be a real challenge. And you got to get the numbers, all these different things. But some of it is, what's our expectation? And I'm not saying to dumb it down, but we do talk about all the great stuff, which you should. But there is also, you need to understand this is really the majority of your job. Again, after the presidential stuff, they would, after 3 or 4 years, have these amazing experiences. But there'd be like 4 or 5. Out of 3 years, so your normal day is not that exciting. It's like you talk about deployment. You'll have these interesting stories, but what happens usually on deployment? At least in my world, it's not as exciting. Do a ship deployment. Oh, you get to hit these ports and do all these cool things. Yep. And between that, it's the same day all the time, over and over again. So it's managing those expectations.
Yeah, and I think that I know for me, like I can totally concur with a lot of what you just said. From my own experience, joining the Navy years ago, so I'm in a similar boat as you. I've been in over 20 years now, and my kids are all the same age as yours, so very similar. And so, but I've got a daughter who recently joined the Air Force and loves it. She's doing great. But then I've got a son who's also looking at the idea of joining. And so we've been sitting in a lot of recruiters' offices lately, and it's been actually pretty interesting. It's actually been pretty eye-opening because I have to give kudos to the recruiters that, at least that we've interacted with. They're asking the right questions. Like, why do you really want to join this branch? Okay, what jobs are you interested in and why? And they're really helping my son to at least think through it. So because of that, we've actually been in 3 different recruiters' offices now of different branches of service because he's thinking it through and he's not just jumping right in because, oh, I like this branch because I like their uniform and I just want to be cool, right? So he's actually thinking about it. Okay, what job do I want to have because I want to have the skills to go do something later, and he's really thinking it through. So I definitely concur with what you're saying, and those. But you're right. Not every opportunity, not always do those conversations happen, to help the young person to really think through what the decisions is being made, so that they're really prepared. And we had another great conversation recently that you might be familiar with as well, and that is just the whole concept of how, that we talked about, is the individual resilient enough, coming in from based on their background. And there's two things that popped into my mind as you were talking about that. One is that Dr. Lisa Miller talks about that, saying that when the young people are growing up, they're how they are raised in their home, in their family unit, and if they are tied into a structured set of spiritual beliefs within a community, that makes them much more resilient coming into adolescence and adulthood, and really prepared well for the service, for being resilient when life stressors come at them. And I know that that's something that you've experienced well in your counseling. And so, I don't know, just back over to you. Have you seen that as well, that when folks, how they were raised and coming into the military, how that really impacts their ability to be resilient later on?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And again, it comes from, like I said before, the first 18 years of life, it's all these experiences. And what do you experience? And, if I'll probably get in trouble for saying it, I'll say it anyway, so maybe we'll delete this out. But, it's, when parents in a very loving, caring, compassionate way want to make sure that their kids are all taken care of and avoid challenges and negativity and difficult things, that's well-meaning, but when they don't face challenges, you have a difficult time dealing with adversity. And so when they're really faced with it, they haven't built that resiliency. And I always give the example, when I talk to my clients and talking about stressors and resilience. It's, have you ever jumped into a cold swimming pool? You're like, yeah, most of us had that. And what's that experience like? It's usually uncomfortable. It's awful. It's shocking to the system. And if I said, okay, as soon as you jump in, it's awful, it's very uncomfortable, jump out, get out of the pool, dry yourself off, just soak in the rays of the sun and stay out for the next hour. All right, now jump back in. Okay. Now get out, cool yourself, just dry yourself. Every time you get back in, it's just as bad as the last time.
Yeah.
But what happens if you stay in? And I always find it interesting that a certain percentage of the people that I talk to, they'll say, it warms up. It doesn't warm up. The water has been the exact same. Your ability to handle it, your ability to deal with it improves. Yeah. You've adapted to it. That's where resilience comes from. And so, when we grow up in situations where we don't have opportunities to fail, don't have abilities to have those challenges, and that as a parent, that's some of the toughest thing to do, is to see your kid hurt, to have difficulty. We want to kind of clear the way for them, but when we do that, what happens? When our job as parents, I think, is to make sure that they are functional adults, that they can leave the home. It's heartbreaking when my kids, left home. It's sad. I love them. I want to, be with them, but that's where they should be. I don't want them living in my basement.
Yeah, exactly.
I want them, to go out and to fly. And I think it's our job to prepare them for that. But that's what happens whether it's joining the military or going to college, or when people leave. Why is it that they seem to struggle? Well, because they haven't really dealt with adversity, and life just smacks them right in the face.
Right.
And then they well, what do I do with that? So it does come from, upbringing, culture, different cultures, whether it's a spiritual, religious culture, whether it's, any other type of, we look at adversity from different lenses, and where does it come from? And so it does greatly, impact us. And again, that's part, I think, like a screening, is what is, your level of resilience. But that's also what I love about the Marine Corps is boot camp is very different from the others. It is all about stress, and how do you manage, stress and difficulty? Can you make good choices in incredibly stressful, difficult times? Because combat is stressful and difficult, and you need to make good, solid decisions. So from day one, when you step on those yellow footprints, it is difficult. It's a challenge, as it should be. And the Marines are different that way from the other services, and as it should be, because we do different things.
Yeah.
So I'm going to even give you an acronym: Chief Psychologist of the Navy, CPN, right? As a CPN, your first action is improving assessment, selection, recruiting, just getting smart on that. What will be your second thing?
I think this is a topic that would probably be really boring that we'll probably edit out, but it would be speeding up administrative processes. When it comes to whether it's administrative separations or medical boards or different things like that, when you're stuck in limbo for the longest time, you're at boot camp and you mess up your ankle and, okay, maybe this isn't the time for me and I need to get out. Why are you languishing, there for so long? Why does it take so long for, paperwork to go through, for people to sign, why can't we just get people, out quicker?
The medical administration mainly?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, a lot of that stuff. And I've talked to a lot of my colleagues, and that's things that they're looking on, because it's challenging if you're, waiting for a medical board, if you've got post-traumatic stress disorder for combat and different things, and then you have to every day keep putting your uniform on and going to work, that could be a trigger. That could be really overwhelming and difficult. Well, now good luck for the next 9 to 12 to 18 months as we work through the process. That's a challenge, and so we want to get people better. And if better is in the military, great. If better is out of the military, great. How do we do that? And so there's, it's, again, maybe this is now my perspective at headquarters is we have amazing programs and processes, but also it's a big bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And it can take a long time. Are there things that we can do to streamline it? And I understand there's sometimes there's a reason why, and unfortunately, because there's maybe a bad event that happened, so we need to include this, and now something else happened, we need to include this, and then just over time, it just becomes very, very cumbersome. And so how do we streamline that? Would be another thing that I would probably do.
Yeah. Anything else, or?
I think those would probably be the main thing.
Yeah.
Continuing to. The Navy has a great program, a warrior toughness program that they're, they've implemented over the last little bit, and trying to now incorporate that with the Marine Corps. So we're kind of talking the same language.
Holistic resiliency
Exactly.
boot camp, right?
Yeah. Just make sure that we're talking the same thing, not adding more things, not adding it on our ad brox to anybody's pack, but just are we talking the same terms? Are we saying things? So when we, the Navy, there's green side and blue side, and kind of going back and forth, and so. I want to make sure that we're talking the same language, saying the same words, that we hear things over and over. So one thing that, one learning process we have is redundancy. We hear things over and over, it starts to be, ingrained. So starting from boot camp, talking about certain terms about, grit and resiliency and different things, when they hear that, more over time and start to understand those terms, it gets better and easier to learn. So, applying those sort of programs, to kind of, amplifying those good programs that we already have.
Yeah. So going back to the first one about who we pick, right, and predicting resiliency, one thing I found interesting is anecdotally, I've always told people, I told my sons this too, because the seniors are looking to go to the Coast Guard, and kind of like you, they did the whole circuit. They're like, oh, go to the Navy. One was gonna be a diver. I'm gonna be an MA. I'm gonna be this. Now I have a Coast Guardie, a Coastie friend who's retiring, and he mentioned this thing called ME, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's kind of like Coast Guard SWAT, right? So they're like, oh yeah, that's what we want to do. So they're all excited about that right now. But one thing I mentioned to them is, they're not wrestlers, but they're doing track right now, and I'm encouraging them to do other sports as well. But for some reason, I found that people that I've met in the Navy, Marine Corps, just all the services, who were wrestlers in high school or college, generally seem to be one of the most resilient people I've ever met, right? And so again, this is not, I didn't research it, but I did research, and my dissertation was on sport and spirituality. And so I looked at other endurance athletes, right? I looked at people who run the Sahara Desert, people who run across America. I mean, we're not talking about marathons here. We're talking about Forrest Gump level of genius or stupidity, whatever you want to call that, right? And my argument in the dissertation was, they're looking for something deeper. There's the search is not for fitness here anymore. In fact, it's counterproductive, right? All fitness probably professionals will say, no, you don't do that if you want to get fit. You do that, right? And there's something about wrestling, and so I began to just think on my own, like, well, wrestlers, one of the things they have to deal with, right, that's kind of unique to them, is they have to cut weight all the time. And so a lot of sports, you got to be fit, you got to work out, you got to train. But one unique thing that wrestlers do all the time, that's like boxers, is they have to restrain themselves from indulging in food, which is one of the hardest things to do as a human being, right? Like, eat twice or eat just oatmeal and eggs and chicken. Like, that's hard, and then also training physically, right? So I find like the mental toughness that wrestlers develop during their time, it really translates into so many other things. Now, it doesn't mean like wrestlers are the end all, right? And wrestlers are like the best fit for the military. Not really, because they got to have other skill sets too, right? Like just, you don't want to just be a meathead wrestler with no other skill sets. They might have a place in the military, but they're not going to be good at everything, right? But, so, I mean, do you ever see any parallels like that with certain either backgrounds? I was like, yes, like, for some reason, they seem to do well.
Yeah, I mean, one, like you're talking about with wrestlers, it's always that's a unique sport in the sense that, it's an individual sport and a team sport at the same time. And so you got to do your individual stuff, but also, it counts towards the team as well. Which again, there's interesting studies on, just individual sports, where you're just running, you're doing this, or you're part of a team, and then the team sports. The other thing, this may sound, sort of odd, but this is coming to some of my assessment selection stuff, is a lot of times I would much rather have the B/C student than the straight A student, because the B/C students, well, they failed. They've had challenges, and so I'd rather look at it like, okay, what do you do when you don't do well? And that was sometimes the challenge when I'm assessing somebody from boot camp, an 18 to 21-year-old kid that eventually I'm going to put them on a program that I've got to sign my name saying they can have a weapon and be within arm's length of the president. Good luck, so that's, a significant pucker factor when it comes to stress. Sometimes, we'd pick these individuals that, high achieving, great, never got in trouble, homeschool kid, straight A, all these things. It's like, well, but what happens if you have a challenge? And I would rather have the person that messed up and still get your clearance, so it's not that bad. But what did you do? What did you learn from that? So talk to me about that situation. And, if they have some general insight or awareness, ownership, it's a whole lot better than like, well, I don't know. Because then now when life hits you, when you have the first opportunity to not be the straight A student, not be the best one, that's a challenge. And one of the things that you brought up, talking about wrestlers and like, restricting food or things like that. One thing that I think is critical for everyone to learn, especially when we're talking about resilience, but it's something that, things that I need to continue to learn. I always joke that I'm like, well, when I get out of the military, I'll write a book, go on Oprah, make a lot of money. And so what would my book be? Well, it would probably be a real quick pamphlet. It wouldn't be a book because, a lot of times people are like, well, what makes people successful? And the 7 habits of highly successful people. I have like one habit or one principle, and that's the ability to delay gratification. If you can delay gratification, you're going to be more successful than other people. However you want to define success, whether that's in relationships or money or things like that, because in the moment you want stuff. Like the wrestler, I really want to eat. I really want to do it. Can you not? Can you not? Like from a spiritual standpoint, fasting. That comes like, this is what I want to do. Yeah, but I want to focus on the spiritual nature. I'm feeding my spirit, not my physical body. And this, I'm willing to do these things. So financially, you might have some money, but can you delay that to save stuff? Can you delay it to do it? You see it in relationships and infidelity and things like that. Well, give into right now pleasure versus the long lasting, positive, joy and happiness of a relationship. So can you delay that gratification? And in this day and age, kind of society, we're kind of an instant gratification, society, and that's we're not teaching that. People aren't learning that. That's a tough skill for people to have.
Right? How does an individual learn that? And sometimes it's just those that have learned it. It's because it's consequential. Like they grew up in a situation where they had to. One of our prior interviews was with the drill instructor of the year, Gary Sergeant Flores, and he grew up on a school bus in Texas, just, not having much. But yet when he reflected on that, he said, we were
Happy.
a great family. We were happy. And who he became because of that was he ended up becoming a very passionate and very dedicated Marine and student to where he just earned his PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And he even says, I don't watch TV. I don't spend time on my cell phone. He says, if I've got extra time, I'm studying, I'm learning something new. I'm pursuing this pursuit. I mean, it's all about delayed gratification. So I think it's that self-discipline, right? It's that being willing to be self-disciplined to say, I'm not going to do this right now because I know this is better if I spend time doing this. And that's huge. And so maybe if there's a way we can begin to insert that into how we train our young people today coming in.
Well, I think sometimes, like for me, when I sort of bring up that principle to some of my clients, some of them are like, well, it's such a foreign concept. Like I've never,
Yeah.
But a lot of times, like, well, you probably do this and you're not even aware of it. So you need to bring it to yourself. Like, how often do you, have you been NJP'd for UA because you didn't get to work? No. Like, well, I bet when your alarm goes off, what do you want? What I want? That's when the covers are the best. That's when the pillow is in the right position. It's like, I want to stay in there.
Birds are chirping.
Exactly. But you get up.
Yeah.
Why? Well, because I don't want to get yelled at. Okay, fine. You're the instant gratification now of wanting to rest, wanting to, that like, it could get worse, and so you get up. And so you probably have those experiences in your life. They might be subtle, they might be little, but it is something that you kind of already do. And so it really helps them, I think it's important to help them see, like, well, you kind of do it. Now let's apply it in a little bit bigger area or in other terms. And so you start, basic with like, some finances or things like that. Try one thing to not do, wait a day, or something like that. But a lot of us, we kind of have that, but we've never been taught to even be aware of it.
Yeah, Mark and Chris, that brings to my mind something that I think has begun. I know as a chaplain doing counseling, I've started to see this trend happening, and maybe you all have as well to be able to speak to this, but is that we start to see now young people coming into the military to where if you were to negatively counsel them, like it causes them just to shut down. And then they can't take that negative feedback of any kind, right? And if you give them that counseling session and say, hey, when you were overslept and you were late to work today, and you provide that counseling, that it just shuts them down, and they don't even want, and they don't respond well to the counseling to be able to bounce back from that and be able to make the changes. And is that something you've seen as well? And going with all the things that we're talking about here, being resilient and being...
I have, and sometimes it's this, it's a difficult cycle because now you're a leader. And so as a leader, are you willing to counsel that person? Because, man, they're going to, they're going to shut down. It's going to be difficult. I don't want to do it. I don't want to trigger it. And so now as leaders, sometimes they don't want to engage. So then no one's doing anything. Yeah. So they're not doing it because they're afraid that people are going to fall apart, and sometimes they do fall apart. And so it's just really interesting. We kind of are playing sort of prevent defense. We're playing not to lose as opposed to playing to win. And sometimes you need to have that hard conversation. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to just knife hand everybody, and scream in their face. I mean, sometimes you need that, but other times there's another way of going about it. And that's from a leader's, you got to learn your own style and what's most important and things like that. That doesn't mean that in my experience, I very rarely, I can count like on one hand how many times I've like really like yelled at somebody, in uniform but I have, and that's part of my style that like when I did, everyone's like, holy crap, commander's really upset, it meant something versus someone that's yelling all the time. So you got to learn your own skill, but yeah, it's difficult because people sort of shut down. And so, well, how do we talk to them, about that? And that gets into, maybe another conversation, whether that's for today or another time, is, resources that are available. Somebody has that conversation, they melt down, where they go? Well, they're taking them to the MTF, I want to make sure that, no one's, gonna hurt themselves. Okay, great, make sure that they're taken care of. But is that the best use for my time and others when I've got, I'm trying to work with others, and just because someone had a bad day, okay, again, maybe that's important and we need to make sure, I'm not saying don't take them, but that then becomes like a medical issue. And well, is it a medical issue or is it a personality? It's a behavioral, it's an administrative thing. Again, pendulum swings both ways. You don't want it to be where it was, I'm sure like the Marine Corps in like the 50s and 60s, very different, now, but we also don't need to swing it all the way to, it's just kumbaya and lovey-dovey, it's okay. You can, I think sometimes when I've been able to tell the command, I'm like, it's okay. You can,
Right.
you can hold this person accountable. It's like, okay, thank you. They feel like, okay, now I can do, they just want to make sure that it's okay.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge because, if you care for people, I mean, at a very personal level, with like kids or others, you can't not give bad information or bad, like challenging feedback. If someone's not doing what you got to tell them, sorry, son, teenager, you smell. You need to take a shower.
Right.
You need to go do that. And you better hear it from your dad than that girl that you like. She goes, oh, you stink. That's not going to go well. So you need to hear it from me.
Yeah.
So, if we care about people, they need to hear these things. It doesn't mean that you're abusive about it and mean about it, but we need to have those conversations. But yeah, some people grow up and they never heard those things. They never had a conversation. So when they hear it from somebody, it's, and again, how are they interpreting it? If they hold their gunny up on a pedestal, that's the guy that I want to be like. I never really had a father figure, and he is awesome, and now he's given me some constructive feedback. He must think I'm the worst person in the world, and I'm never going to amount to anything. No. He actually cares for you. He wants you to do better. But how do you interpret that? And people just fall apart sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you said about delaying gratification. The first time I came across that as a concept for mental health, M. Scott Peck, you ever read him?
Yep,
right?
Yep.
I mean, it's a little dated, his stuff, but I remember him saying, he quotes like the whole Buddhist idea, right?
Yeah.
To live is to suffer. And says that in delaying, because we don't want to delay our gratification, right? Or we want to avoid suffering, we distract ourselves. And in the end, the distraction becomes the greater suffering.
Yeah.
Right. And so it goes back to the whole idea of resilience and how, we just want to move on. We want to be distracted by a sense of progress, a sense of we're back to normal, a sense of things happening. It doesn't matter what it is. It's happening. It's something, right? Because we're uneasy with the quiet. We're uneasy with the stillness, which I believe, I would say most chaplains should be comfortable with, right? The domain of the existential, the metaphysical world of the spiritual, right? Like what is in the silence? What is in the inactivity, in the pause? And I find that this sort of lull we have because of COVID, it's weird. It's become a inactive busyness.
Yeah.
So we're doing less because, people are traveling, teleworking, they're whatever, right? Quarantining, just all kinds of different pauses are happening, but it's not slowing them down. It's just slowing the activity, but it's, spinning them in a different direction, right?
Yeah.
And I still don't know. I mean, obviously being here as well with you, I don't have to think about my unit and like how we're going to all recover from this, and working with the command deck. But if I was, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to skin that cat. It's just, that's tricky.
It is, and one you bring up an interesting point, and one that I think about a lot, and again comes up a lot of times with the clients that come into my office, is again teaching them the principle, having them learn the principle of moderation. And what I found is, anything to the extreme is a problem. But the things that we take to the extreme usually are kind of good at its core. That's why we take it so far, because, well, if this is good, this should be a whole lot better. The example, like, well, not necessarily. It's probably better for me if I make sure that I eat, low fat, no sugar ice cream, but having 5 gallons of that, probably not good. And so, you take anything that's good and we take it too far, it's a problem. And so distraction, it's good. It's not a problem. It's a good coping skill, to distract yourself from things. But if you're always distracting yourself, well, what's going on? What are you avoiding? And this comes up a lot of times with people like, I feel fine until nighttime. Like, yeah, because you've successfully distracted throughout the day. You've been very busy. And when you turn the light off and your head hits the pillow, you got nothing to do but to think.
Yeah.
So all the stuff that you avoided, man, that is just going and going. And so, of course, I can't sleep. So it's okay to avoid, but not to the extreme. It's okay to, have the, again, exercise, great, but if you were, running a half marathon every day, and you're like, that's probably going to blow out your knees and, have all sorts of other problems. So how do we balance it? So like you're talking about, being okay with the quiet. A lot of people aren't, and my question is, well, what's in the quiet? What do you think about? When you got nothing to think about, what are the first things that come up? And maybe that's something you need to talk about, or you need to think about. And so, it would be difficult from like a command perspective, but a lot of times I would be encouraging people on an individual basis is like, well, what do you do? Maybe you can get back to some of those coping skills that you used to have before that we didn't have access to. Because COVID, again, kind of restricted a whole lot of stuff, because if you're quarantined, you can't go out and all you have is at home. That can be a problem if like your coping skill was, I love to travel. Yeah. I love to, like, you don't have access to that. Like, brings it up of a, nice sea story, literal sea stories. This happened when I was on the Ronald Reagan. A lot of times I'll, ask, clients, like, what are you passionate about? What do you like to do? Just to see what kind of coping skills they already have. And this one individual was like, oh, I love, mountain biking, snowboarding, like riding horses. Like, great, a lot of wonderful coping skills. Do we have that availability here? We're now deployed in the middle of the Gulf on a carrier. We don't have horse stables. We're not snowboarding. So had good coping skills, but in that situation didn't have access to it. Right. And so one of the things that we did with this individual is, well, you may not be able to go snowboarding now, but on deployment, let's talk about, I want you to focus on, well, when we get done with deployment, go on a snowboarding trip. Where are you going to go? Who are you going to go with? How do you work out right now to make sure that you're staying in shape to do these things? Why don't you save money to make sure that you can get a better snowboard and bindings? So they were able to do some of the stuff. They couldn't snowboard, but they used that to focus on some of their stuff and, were able to do very well, on deployment. So again, with COVID, what are your coping skills? So you may have had great coping skills. Well, the whole world shuts down and you're stuck at home. What do I do? Yeah. And so they may not have access. So sometimes it's, how do we, gain new skills, find skills that like I said before, you may not be able to snowboard, but let's think about it and kind of incorporate some of these. So, hey, when COVID's over, what are we going to do? Finding, new things to do is important. So, from an individual basis, getting back to stuff, but also let's not take things to the extreme. Let's balance things out. Diversify your coping skills. If you only have one coping skill, like I love to run marathons. Great. Well, now I blew out my knee and I can't run. Yeah. Well, now what do you do? Right. Just like financial, stuff. If you just invest in one thing, if that one thing goes under, well, good luck. Well, that's why you diversify. And so we do that. From a behavioral standpoint, emotional standpoint, we have a lot of coping skills. That's what we need to have. Do you have a spiritual realm? Do you have a cognitive realm, behavioral realm, occupational, relational, all these different things? Yeah. And even if you don't, that's fine. You may not right now, but you might later. Right. And make sure that you're aware of options and opportunities.
That's a common thing, right? Where we see service members who get injured, because this is a physically driven institution, right? Yeah. And then they may have been top performers, but they get injured and now they have to ask for help. Yeah. They feel like the dirtbag, the one that doesn't go on the command hikes and all the other evolutions, and that all they have is appointments, and it just takes away everything. Yeah, we've seen that happen a lot, right? Yeah. But that's because, like you said, they're putting all their eggs in that basket of physical fitness. And so that could kind of, I think, could be a good segue to talk about what I feel really crosses into both our lanes well, which is identity.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's a big discussion. I mean, it's just,
yeah,
it's society, all the things that are going on. Who are you? Who are we?
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
even when you said you're asking new recruits, why do you want to join? Right. That whole why it comes from a place of identity too. Right. It's not obviously you get the answers like, well, I got to pay for college.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's offered and advertised as one of the perks in which why people should join.
Yeah.
But if that's the only thing, then you might have a tough time, right?
Yeah.
Because you're gonna have some challenges, and maybe things might not go your way, as we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But identity, in the past, so I was in this kind of panel for Warrior Toughness. Actually, it's interesting, where at the time Admiral Sands, CEO of the Schoolhouse, and a bunch of others, right? And him being a CEO, he brought his team to NSW. And he wanted the psychs, the chaplains, and all the other sort of caregivers in NSW to sort of help him think through some of this, right? So we're just having a discussion. And I remember a very salty, right, like Master Chief was kind of hinting at like they're just soft now, right? I'm sure we hear that a lot, right? Like they don't make them like they used to. Thing.
Back in my day.
Yeah. So I kind of challenged him a little bit, and I said, there's some truth to that, but some of it is, I don't know if it's because they are like genetically less resilient. Maybe the concepts, right, like honor, courage, commitment, and all these core values, and the identity of like we're in the EGA or these other things that maybe had more impact for previous generations don't mean the same thing today. And so maybe they can be just as resilient, maybe even more, maybe. Who knows, right? But perhaps some of that, the legacy items that feed the identity, need to be updated, need to be more applicable to them, for us to see that, the fruit of that, right? Yeah. What do you think about that? Like the identity of the new recruits, the identity of this generation. And do you feel like there's a disconnect in like the legacy ideas? And then if there is, what's the work that needs to be done?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I mean, that's one thing I love about the Marine Corps, that they give you the identity. You step on the yellow footprints, you don't have a name. It's this recruit. This recruit respectfully requests permission to use the head. Like it's not I, it's not me, it's not your name, it's this recruit. You are nothing. Because the whole concept is we're going to tear all that down, and then we're going to build you up and give you an identity, and that identity is Marine. Right. And that is very different from the other services, which again is why a lot of certain people like you really gravitate towards them because I want that identity. Yeah. But then the question is, that's cool and that's great to have that identity, and it's nice to add to that, but is that like, do you not have an identity before? Right. And I'm seeking something, anything, and that's what I'm going to gravitate towards. So, and so when, it's a great question, like your identity, if someone asks me like, who am I? I talk about, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a Christian, I'm a naval officer, I'm a psychologist. So these are all identities. But if you only have one,
yeah.
Because again, that can be a challenge. Side note, I mean, when it talks about, let's talk about, Marines when they retire. If their whole identity is being an active duty Marine, and that's why they're not former Marine. They're just not on active duty. It's still their identity, but they have a hard time. A lot of us when we take the uniform off. What does that look like? Who am I? In divorce situations, stereotypically. Research shows a lot of times, women can have a tough time if their whole identity has been wrapped up in mother and wife. Mm-hmm. And so now when the kids go to school, they're empty nesters. Yep. And I'm no longer mother. What is my identity? If I'm divorced, and so it's all around relationships. Mm-hmm. And so your identity is key, and that is critical. And I think a lot of it, back to your question, I think the Marine Corps can that's one thing that they offer that isn't with the other services that I don't think we should give up, because I love that, giving their identity.
Yeah.
But again, updating it, what do kids look like and need and want? What does that mean? Again, honor, courage, commitment, being a partisan.
Yeah.
And understanding that identity, like you said, well, I want to join the military to get my school paid for. Okay, well, why the Marine Corps? You could have done that with the Coast Guard. You could have done that with other, why, well, I don't know, he's the only recruiter that answered my phone calls. Okay, well, maybe. But maybe there's something more to that. You would have gravitated towards something else. And so you're picking on, a very, I think, an important topic that the military, the Marine Corps, and the Navy are dealing with, but it's a societal thing.
Sure.
I think society in general, a lot of youth nowadays. I do a lot of work with at my church with my youth, and they struggle with well, who am I?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And if growing up from at least in my faith practice, it's I'm a son or a daughter of God. I believe in some sort of spiritual.
Sure.
Well, that has some sort of framework and founding and identity. But if you don't have any spiritual understanding, well, that's taken away. What's going on in your family life, what's going on in all these. So a lot of times you're like, I don't know who I am.
Yeah.
And what will happen, I was telling people this too, life is going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't proactively, make certain decisions, life's just going to hit you in the face, and you're just going to go where life takes you.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have direction on where you want to go with your identity, someone's going to come along and give you an identity that may not be the one that you want, may not be the right influences that you want to hear. Again, as a parent, if I'm not giving them guidance on certain things, well, they're getting guidance.
Yeah.
The world is giving them guidance. So, they better hear some stuff from me as well, because if not, they're hearing things.
Yeah.
So where is their identity? And I think that is a big societal question that is a tough one to answer.
It is a societal one, and far beyond our pay grade to answer it for society. But we have these small spheres of influence, right, where we can potentially help address some of that.
Yeah.
And I often come back to this idea when it comes to identity, which is in the West, and then my eyes were open mainly when I started traveling.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Africa, I've been to many parts of the Middle East, different parts of Europe, and what I began to see, especially like Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, your identity is not all matter of your choosing.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of inferred and sort of prescribed to you.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways in the West, we may see that as oppressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you have no individual freedom or choice. But I've been telling my kids this, right? And my soapbox is, all the essential and ultimate things in life, you didn't choose. You didn't choose anything.
Yeah.
I mean, you might not have chose me as a father. I might have chosen a more successful and accomplished person.
I got stuck with that guy? Come on.
Right? So, and yet you didn't choose it.
Yeah.
You didn't choose where to be born, nothing. And yet, you're obsessed with making your own choices. You're obsessed with your own freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's delusional, some of that. Yeah. And it's causing us to have an unnecessary identity crisis. Mm-hmm. Some of it. Yeah. And
that's a great point.
And I'm not saying like all the choice we have is bad. Mm-hmm. Some other choices are, every time I travel, I tell my boys, like, if you think, like we have problems and we're, America's in a bad place, just go to the Middle East. It doesn't take long before you realize.
Get your passport. Go visit other places around the world.
This is the best country in the world.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long to realize that. The value for human life is so low in many places, right? As you guys probably know. Mm-hmm. But we still uphold a lot of those things that I think still makes us a place where human flourishing is still more conducive and possible, right? Mm-hmm. But when it comes to identity, I wonder, because like you said, with boot camp, you are born into the Corps. You are a Marine now, and it's your birthday.
Yeah, exactly.
Happy birthday, Marine! Right? Every year they do that, but it's still fragile, right? Because what happens when I feel like the Marine Corps did me wrong, or my gunny or my boss just backstabbed me now, and the Marine Corps just spit me out and doesn't care? I have nothing. Yeah. Right. And so
Or the typical, you took so long to earn that Eagle Globe and Anchor. I'm Marine. Get to your first duty station. They're like, yeah, but you're a PFC. Yeah. So you're like, oh, I thought it was a big deal. It is, but yeah, you're PFC.
Yeah.
And like, that's not, again, expectation. That's not what I thought
Yeah.
the brotherhood or the sisterhood was going to be about.
Yeah.
So, what do you do to help people with this? Because we're dealing with people who are in uniform, right? We can't change society. We can impact maybe our neighbors and our small circles. But okay, the people that have come in and they have identity issues. They come from a vacuum, and there's not much they can grab onto in terms of identity. And their sense of pride in being a Marine got shaken up for whatever reason. Fill in the blank. What do you do? How do you help them ground themselves in bigger things?
Yeah, I think, again, great questions. It's different, again, depending on the person, the background and cultures and all that different thing. But I think in general, one of the things, from, again, a very sort of stereotypical sort of general, standpoint, how would I do that? I start with a lot of, helping empower the person. Helping them. Okay, you may not have identity right now, or you don't think it. So one, there's a lot of exploring. Like, there's probably more identity than you really are giving yourself credit for. So let's kind of pull a thread on that. But also empowering them. Like, what do you want your identity to be? How do you want to people to see? What's your aspiration? What are your goals? What are your desires? And then what can we do to empower you to work on it? Like I said, life is going to run you over. But if you can start making certain decisions right now to get you in that right, so again, the military, there's a lot of resources. So how can we take advantage of different things? And again, it may be too blunt, but the military is going to chew you up and spit you out. Yeah. What can you get from it before it does that? And if that is, they can pay for some of my, tuition assistance now, and I can do that. So I've got more of my GI Bill, afterwards, and I can do these things. And you have been able to educate and elevate yourself. What are your goals? So a lot of it is that empowerment of helping them, realize they've got maybe more control than they think they have. Yeah. Or how do we tackle those barriers that are coming in their way, whether that's systemic, issues, individual stuff, your personality, maybe you're, so afraid of failure, that you're not engaged in things. But I think to me, a lot of it is really working with empowerment to help them, what are your aspirations? And let's, it's an analogy of like, it's your book of life, you know, we're only on the first couple chapters. What do you want, like, by the time you get to the end of your book, what do you want it to be? What do you want to be known for? And then go towards those things. Sure. Because I see a lot of people where they're like, well, just for example, well, I'd love to be a doctor, but I could never be a doctor. Like, why? Yeah. Well, maybe it's because you've never seen someone go through the process. You don't have, models or mentors, but okay, don't sell yourself short. Well, I think I should just be this. Maybe I'll just be a paralegal. Okay, great. If that's what you want to do, great. Why not be a lawyer? What? Yeah. I don't know. And so sometimes they may not even be able to think, sort of higher because of, again, their background and experiences. And so, again, what are your aspirations, and how do you think bigger, and empower yourself to know that you can do that? And then back to, one last thing, one of your comments when it comes to like society and others is, again, it's you got to take the good with the bad. The good of sort of America and individualistic stuff, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can, as hard as you work, you can all these great, wonderful sayings. And it might be true for some people, maybe not for others, and their different experiences. But we're such an individual culture, good. But unfortunately, it sort of takes away what's the sort of collective, what's the society, like what's the group, where other cultures, like Asian cultures or different things, it means something to be, your family name. Don't disgrace the family. Don't do like all as opposed to like, I don't care, this is just me and this is now. Yeah. And so there is something about being part of, again, a group, a school, a company. It used to mean things when you'd work at the same company for 30 or 40 years. Yeah. Now it's like you work for like 2 or 3 years and you go somewhere else. So again, it's a good and the bad. It's great that we have some of this individual great, but we get away from some of those sort of bigger cultural things that can insulate people from from these sort of identity crises that they're going through.
Yeah.
I think too a lot of this ties into meaning and purpose. Knowing what your meaning and purpose is, right? And I'll share with you. This is a really cool quote I heard from. I mentioned Dr. Lisa Miller earlier.
For our listeners,
Yeah.
Dr. Miller is who and what she do?
She is a psychologist, and she has written and researched in the area of spirituality and health and quite a bit. And so, I came across.
She teaches it, right? She teaches at Columbia, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I recently heard her say in a video that talking about meaning and purpose, she said that when you think about meaning and purpose as it relates to your work and who you are as a person, and she says this: if I can translate both my failures and my successes, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, having failed, having made mistakes, or just not being really successful, if I could translate those as well as my aptitudes and my deficits into a calling, into a sense of calling, what's my life about, then I can see my unique contribution. And then I'm outside the world of measurement. In other words, so no longer are you so worried about, the grades that you got, or, how high of a score you got on your fit rep or your eval, or so, because you're just focused on this sense of meaning and purpose and calling, and which I think go along with what you've been talking about, a sense of identity. If an individual can tie their identity to that strong sense of meaning and purpose and calling, then it just skyrockets them up to a place where they're more resilient. And to circle back onto where our conversation began today with COVID, and I remember when I was at MAG 36 in Okinawa, when COVID hit and everything shut down and we're in our rooms, we're in our houses, and all of that happened. I know for me, began to think, well, what's my calling? What's my sense of purpose for me? And that was, of course, being a chaplain, caring for people. And while I couldn't go and visit people face to face like I fully wanted to, I could still do that. I just had to be creative about it, right? And suddenly I became impassioned to find how can I harness technology and be creative about getting after that sense of purpose. And when I realized that, I was like, COVID's not that bad. And then that actually inspired me to then tell everybody that. This goes along with what we were saying, like we talk about on deployment and figuring out, well, what's my sense of purpose? What am I all about? What is my coping skill? How can I translate that into something I can do now, right? And I began to help people out and say, hey, well, pick up a new skill, or start this new thing, or what's your sense of purpose? And then also too, it reminded me of the sea story, Mark, as you were mentioning earlier, that we put on the uniform and sometimes we get our identity wrapped up in the uniform. And I remember my first duty station having a Marine who had gotten injured, and his dream, his identity, his sense of purpose was to be a Marine for life, right? And now he was faced with, I'm going to have to get out of the Marine Corps medical discharge, right? And I remember chatting with him and just saying, okay, well, let's think about this. What's your sense of purpose in life? And after talking with him for a while, he realized, I love helping young people. And suddenly, in an instant, he totally came up with a game plan for getting out of the Marine Corps, how he was going to move to a certain city, and he wanted to go and work with children and youth and help them grow and develop, and to kind of work with underdeveloped areas of the city, and helping young people grow and develop. And suddenly he had a passion and a purpose, and a sense of identity all wrapped up in one. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's a great story.
As we kind of come in.
And as you say that, I think of a very sobering event where I was at Fort Belvoir doing hospital work, and we had an Army staff sergeant who was an orphan, and his sister was the only family he had, and and the Army was basically his family. So, but he was being medically separated as well, and he was a repeat offender. Unusually, this was an inpatient ward. He came like 3 times, so we got to know him well. And I still remember, I saw him Thursday. He's always smiles and just a jokester, just a guy that lights up the room. And the Sunday, he shot himself in the parking lot. And he's one of those cases where, to me, it's just a standout story of an identity crisis that rocked him to the core.
Yeah.
Like, what's he gonna do if he leaves the army? Like, what is he? Who am I? Right? Like, and he couldn't find anything. He was grabbing straws, and so that prospect was just too much to walk into. And so rather, and I mean, right now, this past weekend, right, we had a number of deaths in the Marine Corps too. So it's a sobering reality that this may sound like a philosophical conversation for some, but that's just passing by here. But we all know this is not. This is real, and the identity crisis is very close to home for the meaning, purpose, right? Is very close to home for so many people. As a chaplain, so you shared, Chris, kind of how you deal with that and help people identify aspirations, goals, and other ways to build some of that. I think for us, and please, Steve, chime in if I don't want to speak for you, but the meaning, purpose, but also moral foundations, right, are things that we try to help bring attention to in those people. But man, I find that when they don't come into the service with anything like that, it's extremely hard to start from ground zero and just like build this structure out of nothing.
Yes.
And the easier ones are like, okay, somebody comes in and they have some confusion, they had some bad spiritual experiences, or right? They have a hodgepodge of stuff. So, okay, let's kind of walk through that. Let's parse it, unpack it. Can we come to something that can build you up somehow, right? And I try to identify it. But there are people that come in with nothing, and it's not a nothing in their background. It's with a curiosity. It's a nothing as with maybe resentment and bitterness and disconnection from family. Man, those are tough. Those are really tough, and they're isolated, right? No social resources either, and it's definitely a battle to fight for hope. That's kind of what I would, I every time I talk to a sergeant major, it's one of the things I like to bring up, right? Because as senior leaders, this is something that they recognize probably better than anybody else in the Marine Corps. I say, Sergeant Major, X, you got 2 Marines. They both are rock stars. They crush it during deployment. One comes back. They're thriving. The other one is self-destructing because they don't have hope.
Yeah.
How do you teach that? How do you build that? How do you factor that in to readiness, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes I get a very profound response of like, they really wrestle with that because they understand at their level. Those are the things they're thinking about too, right? It's like, how do you give this stud sergeant who is like top of everything, but deep inside there's an emptiness, right? And how do you help them? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is like the $1 million question. I mean that's when it comes to today's topic isn't a focus on death by suicide, but when we look at it, factors contributing to those things, the one of all the different, sort of variables that we look at, the strongest one is hopelessness. If you don't have hope, that's where we're at. And so that's where a lot of therapy comes. It's like, we've got to instill hope. How do we instill hope? And that, again, is different from every person, but that's the key, because when you don't have hope, and then it's tough when you're young, because you can talk all day long about, well, it'll get better or these certain things, but when you're focused on the now and right now, when the love of your life has left you, for your best friend, deployment, and they're like, that's the word. Being able to like, oh yeah, well, there's more fish in the sea, you'll be fine, all right. Well, yeah, I'm 50 years old. I know that there's, I have more life experiences to know. But in the moment, this is the worst pain that you've ever experienced, and you don't even see tomorrow, let alone next week, next month, or whatever. And so it's a challenge to try to instill hope, but that really is the challenge. Is how do we do that? How do we build hope in people when they're losing it?
Right.
Whether that's from a spiritual standpoint or anything else.
Yeah.
We need to instill hope, because that hopelessness, that's really the main variable that comes into play. Yeah.
We've had conversation earlier, right, about chaplain and psychologists or mental health kind of lanes. And I'm sure that's something that a lot of people are confused about too. It's like, well, I don't go to see the chaplain. I'm not religious. Or, if I go to the mental health side, are they gonna like analyze me and like neuter me of my faith or like, right? Who knows? So there's a lot of these stereotypes.
Mhm.
And we talked about how I've had great relationships with most of the psychologists I've worked with. But I know it's not always the case. Sometimes we're in our own silos and we just kind of do our own thing.
Yeah.
But from your seat and your background, where do you think the partnership really works well, and where is the different domain of specialty, and how can people? What's the right So if a Marine walks in, how should they think of the different services, right, in mental health as well as chaplain, and how to take advantage of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've had great relationships with the chaplains that I've worked with, and a lot of it is building the relationships, professionally, and then having that confidence of knowing what each person is comfortable with doing. And one, it's a misnomer to think that you can only go to one. You can go to both. You can see a chaplain and the doc. That's okay. But want people to know that we do a lot of consulting with one another. Most of the chaplains that I know are very skilled. There are a lot of times great clinicians. A lot of them have master's degrees and different things. So you can do a lot of counseling. And so one that helps me out when I'm like, okay, my caseload is full. There's a big complaint. I can't get in to go see the doc. Yeah. Well, it's a bad analogy, but just because you have a headache doesn't mean that you need to go to a neurologist. There are other things that you can go to beforehand. Yeah, and so a lot of times, like, well, something's wrong. You got to go to the MTF. Maybe, but maybe there are other things that we can do. And so with a lot of the chaplains that I know, they're really good counselors. Great, go there, and they also know their boundaries. Like, okay, now I think it's crossing over to something that there might be an actual diagnosable condition here. I'm gonna make a referral. Great. So we have those conversations, and we move clients back and forth. But also, at least for me, from my standpoint, one of the things that ethically I need to be is culturally competent. And I view that, religion and spirituality is one of those sort of culturally competent things, that I don't make assumptions on people's, spirituality. I have a certain, spiritual belief and framework and what I grew up in and what I believe, but not everybody else does. And so just like I would talk to anybody else, I don't know what the experience would be like growing up in the inner city if I was a person of color. I'm not that. So I don't make assumptions. I'll talk to what does that experience mean to you? Help me understand what that was like. Same thing from a spiritual standpoint. I'm not that faith or that religion. What does that mean? Teach me. Help me understand. So we have those conversations, and then consulting to the chaplains, like, hey, I need more information about this. How can we get this person connected with more of their faith group? Again, as on the I think it's again on the Reagan, and an individual came to me and was very, very devout Hindu. Like, I'm not Hindu. I don't, so the person did a great job of explaining some things. But like, okay, you probably need more. We don't have a Hindu chaplain on the carriers, but talking to the chaplain, like, how do I get her connected with that community? And so they did a great job finding numbers, connections, different things. I was able to provide stuff. And so again, it's having those conversations. So it's not either or. It's not, I'm completely secular and you're just completely spiritual. There's a lot of back and forth. And again, I hope that I know my lane. Like, okay, there's more spiritual stuff going here. I'm going to defer, just as you guys know. There's more clinical stuff. We're going to defer. So we just having those relationships, those good professional relationships are key. And I would say for any client coming in, regardless of whether you're talking about spirituality or anything, you are the consumer. You are the client. Talk, bring up questions, be proactive. If you've got concerns or issues, let's talk about that. And I'll get you where you need to be, whether that's with me or somebody else. Don't feel like, well, it's the only person that can see me. That's the only person that was available. Well, if someone else, you've got a better personality, connection with a different type of a therapist, or we'll get you where you need to be. But again, let's bring it up. You're the consumer. You're the one that we want to help, and we'll get you where you need to be. So ask the chaplain if you've got questions about, confidentiality, what goes with the command, what can I talk to him about? I've got spiritual questions, like whatever. Let's talk about that. Be proactive in your own, in your own care.
Yeah. I think, Mark, just to answer that question too, from the chaplain perspective, is that Chaplains have a piece that we can provide that's 100% confidentiality, which is a little bit different. In other words, we don't have to report anything, which is unique for us. So we can sometimes be that first listening ear. But at the same time, too, it's the reminder to everyone that chaplains, our job is to care for everybody, whether you have a spiritual background or not. Just like you just mentioned, Chris, that you're here to take care of everybody, whether they have spiritual background or not, right? So we all are doing that. We're all providing that care. But there's some slight differences, slight nuances in how we provide that care. But at the end of the day, we're all a team, and we're all trying to help individuals to process through what they're going through and find answers. So, but as a chaplain, we do provide that unique aspect of being able to get religious support. If we can't provide that religious support, we'll help get that religious support. So it's key.
Excellent. Yeah, great conversation. And as we kind of come to a close, I'd like to ask you, Chris, your thoughts. If you're the CPN for the day, right? Chief Psychologist of the Navy for the day. So advising triads, command leaders, and just Marine leaders in general, what are some things they can do or prioritize to increase mental health, mental performance, throughout their ranks, and what are some things that you would sort of leave with them?
So a couple things. One, what I've seen over the last number of years is leaders now are very educated. They're very well equipped with a lot of things, and they're doing a lot of things right. So they don't need to second guess themselves. They're doing very well. What I would say is people watch. People watch to see what leaders, do or say, in different briefs and different things that are coming up. We can talk all day long about dispelling stigma of mental health, but you can say that, and then if you're not the one that's even at the all hands brief, people pick up on that. Oh, it's important, but no one's here. I got this gunny that's telling me and Sergeant Major isn't here, or the CO isn't there. People watch, they see what's going on. So be there, be visible, lead by example. It's what Marines do. And one thing that I would encourage, Marines to do, and again, I've seen that the pendulum swing, back and forth. One thing that Marines do a fantastic job of is taking care of Marines. I think better than any other services. Unfortunately, what I have seen pendulum swinging, lately in the last, number of years is kind of getting away a little bit from those kneecap to kneecap discussions. Because like you said before, I talk to somebody, they have a meltdown, and now I'm going to just send them to the MTF. Someone comes to me with a problem, heaven forbid there's a bad outcome, and I didn't send them to the MTF. So everyone's going to the MTF. Everyone's being referred. Well, what does that do for the Marine? Like, I finally came to my leader with a problem, and their first reaction is to send me somewhere else. We might look at it as like, well, I'm getting you where you need to be. They might interpret it as, I finally opened up to Gunny, and he's kicking me away.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you don't send people where they need to. Definitely make those referrals. But don't be afraid of the mentorship and that kneecap to kneecap discussions. Not everything is clinical. Not everything, is a spiritual, disaster or clinical disaster. Again, you don't need to come to me. I will use this story, that there's a Marine that came to me a number of years ago. And again, he was having a tough time. Command was, riding him hard. He was having a hard time adapting and adjusting. And the reality was people were making fun of him because he smelled. And he wasn't showing up on time, and so, put deodorant on, shower every day. Let's talk about these. And so it was more like a big brother, like, this is what you need to do. And remarkably, get a haircut once a week and take a shower and do that. People backed off and he did just fine. Did you need the board certified PhD to tell him to shower? No. I'm more than happy to work with him, and that was great. But that's more of that kneecap to kneecap, put your arm around somebody like, look, this is what's going on. You don't have to yell at them or make fun of them, but hey, come on, this is what's happening. And I think we've kind of gotten away from that because we're so afraid of something bad happening. So I would, make sure, again, if I was, whatever the title was for the day, there is this sense of, again, heaven forbid there's a bad outcome. Like, well, it's not punitive. We need to, talk about these. Well, it sure feels punitive if I've got to write a report and I got to go to the general's office and explain what happened. That feels punitive, even though you can say all day long it's not. Going in front of somebody with stars to explain something, that's really stressful. So how can we eliminate that from a leadership standpoint, to where people are comfortable, being able to talk about these things? We do it in the medical community all the time. When there's a bad outcome, how can we learn from it? What can we learn from it? How do we, what are the steps that we need to? And we've gone away. Medical used to be, again, 10, 15 years ago, there was, the huge boards that something bad would happen. You'd be scared that you'd lose your license. It would be, that culture has changed. We need to kind of bring that kind of culture as like, okay, if something like that happens, we learn from it. Again, we're doing better. We've got like a lot of reports. There's a lot of things that we're doing better, but that would be something. Just don't be afraid to have the kneecap to kneecap discussions, more mentorship discussions. Don't be quick to send people off. If they need to, great, send them, please. But not every case is needed for that. And probably a couple-minute conversation, doing some good mentorship, being a big brother to somebody or a surrogate father, because maybe they never had any of that. No one told them this is how you use deodorant. This is what you do. That's what they need. So that's what I would encourage.
Yeah, sound wisdom from a seasoned psychologist, a naval officer. Steve, you have any final words to add?
No, that's exactly correct. I mean, and I think that in my realm, as we've been actually looking at the whole area of total fitness, so looking at mental, social, physical, and spiritual fitness and resiliency, we talk about all those things. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again from the leadership in my realm is it's all about empowering small unit leaders. And that's exactly what you just said. We need to get our small unit leaders comfortable talking about these kinds of things with their Marines and doing so proactively, right? It's getting your Marines together in a school circle and be willing to talk about spiritual fitness, for instance. It doesn't have to be the chaplain, right? Or talk about mental fitness and to talk about these social fitness, to talk about these things. But then when those mentoring times need to happen, that they're doing that and mentoring their Marines, because that's where it's most effective at the small unit level. So no, that's all good stuff. And it's definitely, I would say, totally concur. That's how what we need to do is to empower and strengthen leaders to do just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, great conversation. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
And we might have you back as a guest co-host or something when we need to grill some other people in this show. So
anytime. Glad to be here.
Thanks.
So, take care.
This concludes another episode of the 0 to 100 podcast. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, be strong, be courageous.